The old woman didn't notice the man watching her, but everyone else did. It was just past midnight when the storm hit, the kind of storm that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. Rain slammed against the diner windows so hard it drowned out the hum of the jukebox and made the neon sign outside flicker like a heartbeat. Inside, the place smelled of burnt coffee, wet coats, and something older, loneliness maybe. The waitress, Darlene, was wiping down the counter for the third time in 10 minutes, humming softly to herself. She was used to nights like this. The highway went quiet after 10. You'd get a trucker, a couple drunks, maybe a local too restless to sleep. But this man, the one who stepped through the door right then, didn't look restless. He looked wrecked. Rainwater ran off his jacket in steady rivulets, pooling at his boots. His hands were shaking, his eyes scanning the room like he'd just walked into a dream he didn't recognize, or didn't want to recognize. He didn't move, didn't take a seat, didn't even close the door behind him. Just stood there half-shadowed in the doorway, the storm at his back. "Evening," Darlene called over, her voice soft but steady. "You get caught in that mess out there?" He didn't answer. His eyes weren't on her. They were locked on the far booth, the one by the rain-streaked window. An old woman sat there, alone. Her gray hair was pinned neatly behind her ears. Her cardigan was buttoned to the throat, and her small, weathered hands rested on a chipped coffee mug gone cold. She wasn't reading. She wasn't eating. She just stared out the window like she was waiting for something, or someone. In the faint glow of the neon, her silver locket caught the light, a small dent on the side. The chain thin and worn from years of wear. The man's breath hitched. Darlene frowned, sensing something shift in the air. "Sir, you okay?" He didn't seem to hear her. His eyes were wide, locked on that locket, his whole body gone still. Except for his hands, which started trembling harder, a flash of lightning lit up the diner for one sharp, electric moment. And that's when he saw it clearly. The same dent. The same chain? The same necklace his father had died clutching in his hand. The sound left his throat before he could stop it, half gasp, half prayer. His pulse spiked, heart pounding against his ribs like it was trying to break out. He stumbled forward, gripping the counter for balance. The world felt tilted. "The air too thin, sir?" Darlene tried again, her tone changing. "You need me to call someone?" He shook his head, rain still dripping from his hair. His voice came out hoarse, broken. Who is that woman?" "The one in the booth?" Darlene asked, glancing over. "That's Miss Margaret. Comes here every Friday. Always sits in the same spot. Orders one coffee and never finishes it." She smiled faintly. "Been doing that for years." He swallowed hard. "Why?" Darlene blinked. "Why what?" "Why every Friday?" He pressed. "What's she waiting for?" The waitress's smile faded. "Far as I know, no one. Maybe herself." He didn't hear her. His hand went into his jacket pocket, fumbling, shaking until he pulled out an old photograph. The edges were curled, the corners torn. He laid it on the counter, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father took this. During the war. Said this nurse saved his life." Darlene leaned over to look. The photo showed a young woman, smiling, dirt-smudged but bright-eyed, her hair tucked under a field cap. Around her neck hung a locket. The same locket. Darlene's eyes darted between the picture and the booth. "That's older than me," she said softly. He nodded once, his jaw tight. He used to talk about her. Said she promised she'd find him after the war. Said she wore that necklace every day. But she never came. He turned, staring at the old woman again, and suddenly, the years seemed to fold in on themselves. She wasn't just an old woman at a booth anymore. She was the ghost of a promise. The echo of a story that had never found its ending. Darlene hesitated, lowering her voice. "Sir, you look pale. You sure you're all right?" He didn't answer. His body moved before his mind did. One step, then another. The diner floor creaked under his boots. Margaret looked up then, as if she could feel him coming. Her eyes, soft, distant, gray as the storm, met his, and in that instant something shifted. Her hand, still trembling, went to her chest. Her fingers brushed the locket, and her lips parted slightly. recognition. For a moment, time stopped. The lights flickered. The jukebox stuttered and went silent. He took one more step, his voice shaking. "Ma'am, did you know a man named Henry Cole?" The name hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. The old woman froze. Her breath caught, and the color drained from her face. The mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the linoleum. The sound echoed through the diner, sharp, final, heavy, her eyes filled with tears. She whispered something that only he could hear. "Henry." The way she said it, soft, trembling, reverent, told him everything. The waitress froze behind the counter, hand over her heart. The man took another step closer, his throat tight. "He was my father." Lightning split the sky outside, flooding the diner with white light, and in that moment, both of them stood suspended between past and present, between loss and revelation. The rain poured harder, washing against the glass as if the storm itself couldn't stand the weight of the silence that followed. Margaret's tears fell freely now. She pressed the locket to her lips, whispering something only she could understand. A name, a prayer, a memory too heavy to carry. He stood there motionless, the photograph still in his trembling hand. For 30 years, he'd wondered what became of the woman his father never stopped loving. Now, standing under flickering neon in a half-empty diner, he had his answer. She'd been waiting, every Friday, for him and tonight. She didn't have to wait anymore. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The storm howled outside, wind scraping against the diner's glass, lightning flashing like the sky itself was trying to remember. The waitress, Darlene, stood frozen behind the counter, unsure whether to speak or vanish into the background. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to hold its tick. The old woman's lips trembled. "Say that name again," she whispered, her voice fragile as paper. "Henry," the man said quietly, stepping closer. "Henry Cole." Her hand clutched the locket tighter, knuckles white. "Dear Lord," she breathed, tears cutting down her cheeks. He had a son?" He nodded, unable to speak. Margaret leaned back in the booth, one trembling hand pressed to her heart. The years seemed to collapse around her. Every Friday she'd come here, every cup of coffee that had gone cold, every empty night waiting for a knock that never came. "He never told me," she said softly, eyes glassy with disbelief. "He never told me he had a boy." The man's jaw tightened. "He didn't know. My mother died when I was a baby. It was just him. And that locket, it was all he had left of you." Her eyes closed. Her lips parted, and for a moment she looked like that young nurse in the photograph, 20 years old, fearless, standing under a canvas tent in the middle of chaos, believing love could outlast war. "I never stopped writing," she said at last. "Not for years," he frowned. "Writing?" She nodded slowly, the chain of her locket glinting under the diner light. "Letters. Every month, sometimes more. After the war ended, I wrote him at the hospital in Marseille. When they said he'd been moved, I wrote to the new address. And when that came back unopened, I wrote to the Red Cross, then to the Veterans Office. Then, nowhere at all," her voice cracked. Every letter came back. Every one. Darlene's hand went to her mouth. The man lowered himself into the booth across from her, rain still dripping from his hair, the photograph trembling in his hands. "He never got them," he said quietly. "None of them," Margaret's breath hitched. "Then he thought I'd forgotten him." "He didn't," the man said. "Not once." The silence that followed was heavier than any thunder. Outside, the rain softened, turning from a roar to a whisper. Inside, the neon light buzzed faintly, washing the room in pale red and blue. Margaret opened the locket with shaking fingers. Inside, a faded photo. The same young soldier who'd once smiled beside her in that torn photograph. The edges were worn smooth, but the image was still clear. She traced his face with her thumb. "He promised me he'd come back. Said he'd build a house on the hill by the river. Said I'd never have to work another night shift again." Her laugh came out like a sob, and I believed him. "Foolish, isn't it?" The man shook his head. "No, not foolish." She looked up at him then, studying his face. There was something in his eyes. The same soft brown, the same way they flickered when he was holding back emotion. "You've got his eyes," she whispered. He tried to smile, but it broke halfway through. He used to tell me stories about a nurse who sang old hymns when the bombs got close. Said her voice was the only thing that made him believe he'd live another day. Margaret's breath caught again, a trembling hand covering her mouth. Darlene, quiet all this time, stepped forward slowly. "Ma'am, maybe you two should sit a while." "I'll bring some coffee." Neither of them answered, but she poured 2 cups anyway. The clink of the mugs against the table was the only sound in the room for a long minute. Finally, Margaret spoke. "How did he die?" The man stared into his coffee. "Peacefully, at home. He had a bad heart. I was with him." She nodded, tears falling again, her hands folded in front of her like she was praying. "He was brave. I knew he would be. Even when he was scared, he never let it show. I remember one night, there were shells so close the ground shook. He sat beside a wounded man for hours, wouldn't move until the bleeding stopped. Said if he was going to die, he'd rather do it doing something good." The man smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Margaret looked out the window. Her reflection ghosted against the rain. "He told me once. He didn't believe in destiny. Said people make choices and choices make people. But when he looked at me, he said maybe he was wrong." Her voice cracked. I held on to that. He didn't know what to say. The words in his throat all felt too small for the weight of what she was carrying. After a while, she opened her purse. Her fingers fumbled through folded napkins, old receipts, small mementos, until she pulled out a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with string. "I kept them all," she whispered. "Every letter I sent, every one that came back." The man reached for them but stopped halfway, afraid to touch something so sacred. "You still have them?" "I couldn't throw them away," she said. It felt like throwing him away. He finally reached out and took them gently. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was neat, careful, full of the kind of hope that only young people in love ever have. He read the top one. "My dearest Henry, the war can't last forever, can it? They say spring will come soon. Maybe when it does, we can start again. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere safe." He closed it before he could finish. His hands were shaking too hard. Margaret smiled weakly through her tears. "That was the last one I wrote before they told me he was gone. I never knew it was a lie." He looked up sharply. "A lie?" She nodded. "A nurse friend of mine. She told me later the transport records were wrong. His unit was listed among the fallen. I spent years thinking he was dead. By the time I found out otherwise..." She stopped, looking down at her lap. It was too late. He was already gone again. The man stared at her, a storm of disbelief and sorrow twisting in his chest. "He searched for you, too. He tried. But your trail vanished." Margaret's voice grew small. "I know. I saw the ad in the paper once. A name, a town, but no way to answer. I was already married then. Life had moved on. Or at least that's what I told myself." The rain eased into a soft drizzle. The jukebox hummed back to life, an old tune warbling through the static. Darlene quietly refilled their cups and slipped away again. Margaret looked at the photograph still lying between them on the table, 2 young people smiling, against the backdrop of a war they thought they could survive. "You know what's funny?" she said softly. "I used to come here on Fridays because this was where the bus stopped that took me to the nursing home. I'd sit here, have my coffee, and tell myself I wasn't waiting. But I was always waiting." He reached across the table and took her hand. It was cold but steady. "He'd be glad you didn't stop," he said. "He never did either." Her lips trembled and a tear slid down her cheek. "You tell him, when you see him again, that I kept my promise. I wore this every day." She touched the locket again. "And I prayed for him every night." "I will," he whispered. Outside, the first hint of dawn began to break. Faint gold light bleeding through the clouds, softening the edges of the night. The storm was over. But something else had broken open too. Something gentler, older, finally free. For the first time in 30 years, Margaret didn't look out the window. She looked at the man sitting across from her, at the living proof that love doesn't die, It just waits. And in that small, half-empty diner at the edge of town, two lives that had circled each other through decades of silence finally met in the middle. The diner had grown still again. The storm outside was gone, but its memory lingered. The faint smell of wet asphalt, the hiss of rain dripping from the gutters, the hum of the old neon sign struggling to stay lit. Inside, the air felt heavy, not with silence, but with things unsaid. Margaret stared at the man sitting across from her. The resemblance was uncanny. The curve of his jaw, the furrow in his brow when he was thinking, even the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he didn't know what to say. It was like looking through a window into the past. He watched her carefully. She'd gone quiet again, eyes distant, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, like someone walking barefoot over broken glass. "There's something I never told anyone," she said. The man leaned forward. "About my father?" She nodded. For a moment, she couldn't look at him. Her hands shook as she opened the locket again, staring down at the photo inside, the young soldier smiling in the dim light of a war tent. "After he left," she began, "I found out I was pregnant." The words hung in the air like the aftershock of thunder. The man froze. "You mean—" Her eyes lifted to meet his. Tears shimmered but didn't fall. "You had a sister," his breath caught. "What?" "She was born in the spring after the war," Margaret whispered. "I named her Grace." He sat back, the name echoing in his mind. Grace. She never knew her father, Margaret continued. "I told her stories about a brave man who helped people, who never gave up, who believed kindness mattered even when the world was falling apart. She used to ask why he never came home. I didn't have an answer she could understand." She smiled faintly, remembering. She looked just like him when she smiled. Same dimples, same spark, but life wasn't kind. Times were hard. I worked nights, took shifts no one wanted. Grace got sick when she was 10. I did everything I could, but... Her voice broke. She didn't finish. The man swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I'm sorry," he whispered. She nodded slowly. "I buried her myself. Small grave out by St. Mary's. No headstone. I couldn't afford one." Her eyes glistened as she looked at him again. "That's why I never went looking for Henry after that. I didn't have anything left to give. And when I heard he'd died, I thought maybe it was God's way of sparing us both." The man pressed a hand to his forehead, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. "He should have known," he said quietly. "He would have wanted to know." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I was afraid. What if he'd moved on? What if he'd forgotten me? I didn't want to be the ghost that ruined his new life." He shook his head. "He never forgot you. Not once." She smiled through her tears, the kind of smile that comes only when pain and love meet in the middle. "Maybe that's why I came here every week. Some part of me still hoped that someone might walk through that door and say his name again." Lightning flashed faintly in the distance, and for a moment, it painted the diner in soft gold. The world outside was beginning to wake. Trucks on the highway, the early chirp of birds, the sound of tires on wet pavement. But inside, time felt suspended. The man reached into his jacket again, pulling out something small and wrapped in cloth. He laid it on the table. "This belonged to him," he said. She hesitated, then unfolded the fabric. Inside was a tarnished silver ring, old, scuffed, engraved on the inside with two initials, H+M. Margaret gasped. Her fingers trembled as she held it up to the light. "He kept it?" "Every day," the man said. "He wore it on a chain around his neck. When he passed, I took it. I didn't know what it meant until now." Her tears finally fell, one after another, onto the ring that had outlived the love it was meant to seal. "He was going to ask me," she whispered. "The night before he shipped out, he said he had something for me. I thought he'd changed his mind when he came back from patrol with empty hands." She looked at the ring again. "He must have been waiting for the right moment." The man nodded, his own eyes damp. "He said something once that when I was a kid, I asked him if he'd ever been in love. He smiled and said, Once, with a woman who could calm a storm just by looking at it. I thought it was a story. Margaret's voice cracked. It was. The diner door creaked as a gust of wind slipped through. Darlene quietly turned off the jukebox, sensing that whatever was happening at that booth was bigger than words. Margaret looked at the ring one last time before pressing it gently into the man's palm. "You keep it," she said. "It's yours now." "He'd want you to have it." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. It's yours. It started with you," she smiled softly. "Then maybe it should end with both of us." He didn't understand at first, until she slipped the chain from around her neck. The silver locket glimmered in her wrinkled hand as she placed it beside the ring. "The necklace and the ring," she whispered. Two halves of a promise that never got its ending. He looked at her, really looked. This wasn't just a woman clinging to memories. She was a bridge between the past and the present, a reminder that love, even when broken, still leaves light in its cracks. "You know," she said after a while, wiping her cheeks, "I used to dream he'd send me one last letter, just to say he was okay, that he forgave me for not finding him." The man's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Maybe he did," she frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small yellowed envelope. The edges were worn, the ink faded, but her name was still clear. To Margaret. Her breath stopped. "Where did you—" "It was in his old chest," he said quietly. "I found it after he passed. It was sealed, but never sent. I didn't open it until tonight." Her hands shook as she took it from him. For a moment, she couldn't even breathe. Then she tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page. The handwriting uneven but familiar. She read silently, lips trembling as her eyes filled again. When she finished, she looked up at him, voice barely a whisper. He said he never stopped looking. That he forgave me. That if I ever read this, it meant he'd finally made it home, one way or another. The man swallowed hard. "Then maybe he did." Margaret smiled faintly through her tears. "Then I suppose this is him keeping his promise." Outside, the clouds finally broke apart, and a soft beam of sunlight poured through the diner window, landing on the table, on the ring, the locket, and the letter that had waited half a lifetime to be read. For the first time in decades, Margaret didn't feel alone. And the man, her lost love's son, didn't either. Two strangers bound by grief, time, and the stubborn endurance of love sat quietly, letting mourning fill the spaces where words couldn't. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in hours. Rain still clung to the glass of the diner windows, each drop catching the light like tiny shards of memory. Margaret sat quietly, the opened letter resting in her trembling hands. The paper was old, fragile, the ink faded in places, but the words still carried his voice. Every line felt like an echo from a man who'd loved her across decades, through war, through silence, through time itself. Her eyes drifted toward the window. The storm had passed. The road shimmered wet and golden beneath the sunrise. The man, still sitting across from her, didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just watched, trying to memorize this moment. This woman who somehow held the final piece of his father's story. Finally, she folded the letter carefully and tucked it back inside the envelope. "He waited too long," she said softly. "But maybe we were both waiting for the right time." He nodded, his voice low. "Maybe this is it." They sat there in silence, the kind of silence that feels holy. Then, as if guided by something unseen, Margaret reached for her coat and slowly stood up. "There's something I need to do," she said, her voice steadier now, "and I'd like you to come with me." The man rose without hesitation. The waitress, Darlene, watched them go. The old woman in her faded cardigan, the stranger who'd walked in out of the storm. She didn't ask where they were headed. She just nodded quietly and whispered, "Be safe out there." Margaret smiled faintly. "We will." The wind was cold but clean outside. The rain had washed everything. The pavement, the sky, maybe even their hearts. They drove in silence, his truck humming low as the tires hissed over wet asphalt. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain. When Margaret finally pointed to a small dirt road that veered off the main highway, he slowed. The road led uphill, toward a tiny church surrounded by tall oak trees, the kind that creaked softly when the wind passed through them, like they'd seen too much and learned to whisper instead of shout. The cemetery behind the church was small, simple, peaceful. Margaret stepped out, clutching the letter and the locket in her hand. Her shoes sank into the damp grass as she made her way to a weathered corner near the edge of the property. She stopped in front of an unmarked grave. "No headstone," she murmured. "Couldn't afford one." The man stood beside her, his chest tight. He could almost see it. A younger version of this woman standing in this same spot decades ago, saying goodbye to a daughter she'd raised alone and buried too soon. Margaret knelt down slowly, her knees trembling. She brushed her hand over the grass, clearing away a few stray leaves. "Grace," she whispered. "Your father finally found you." The man swallowed hard. He knelt beside her and placed a small wildflower from near the church fence at the grave's edge. "And she found him," he said quietly. "In her own way," Margaret nodded, blinking back tears. "He said in the letter that he wanted to be buried somewhere peaceful. Not with soldiers. He'd had enough of war. Just somewhere quiet where love could still find him. Do you know where he's buried?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I do." She looked at him, eyes wet but hopeful. "Will you take me there?" The drive was longer this time, out past the edge of town, where the hills rose soft and green. When they finally stopped, it was at a small veterans' cemetery by the river. No marble angels or elaborate gates, just rows of modest white stones and a single flag fluttering in the breeze. The man led her down the path until they stopped at one grave. Henry Lawson, 1919-1984. Margaret stood frozen. Her breath caught as she read the name. Her fingers touched the letters like she was tracing them onto her heart. After a long silence, she whispered, "Hello, Henry." The man took a step back, giving her space. The river murmured softly behind them, the air filled with birdsong and the faint rustle of wind through the grass. Margaret knelt again, the locket still in her hand. She opened it one last time and stared at the photo inside. Young, smiling, full of hope. "You always said you'd come back," she said quietly. "Guess you finally did." She took the ring he'd once meant to give her and laid it gently on the grave, right beside the flowers someone had left earlier that week. Then, she unfolded the letter, the same one that had crossed decades to reach her, and placed it next to the ring. "Letters find their way home," she said softly. "Even when people don't," her voice trembled. "I thought I'd never see you again, Henry. But you've been with me every day. In every cup of coffee, every lonely Friday night, every storm that came and went. You stayed." Tears rolled down her cheeks, but her smile never faded. The man's throat tightened. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a single photo, his father holding him as a baby, both laughing. He set it gently beside the ring and the letter. "Now you're all together," he murmured. Margaret exhaled shakily, her hands still trembling. "Thank you," she said. "For finding me," he smiled faintly. "No, ma'am. You found me." They stood there for a long time, neither wanting to break the silence. The river kept moving, the wind whispered through the grass, and the sun climbed higher, washing everything in soft, forgiving light. At last, Margaret took one step back, her gaze still on the grave. "He said once that love doesn't die," she whispered. "It just waits." And he was right, the man said quietly. "He waited for you." Her eyes shimmered. "And I waited for him." They walked back to the truck together. Margaret paused before opening the door and looked back at the hill. "You know," she said, "I used to be afraid of endings. Now I think they're just beginnings wearing different clothes." He smiled, watching her. "He'd like that," she nodded. "He would." As they drove away, the camera of life seemed to pan wide, the tiny white grave growing smaller behind them, the sunlight spilling across the trees, the road stretching forward. Margaret rested her head against the window, the faintest smile on her lips. For the first time in decades, her heart was light. The letter, the ring, the locket, they were all behind her now. But the love they carried? That she took with her. The diner was quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm, not empty, just at peace. Darlene stood by the counter, refilling the coffee pot out of habit. The morning rush hadn't started yet. A few truckers sat near the window, half listening to the radio, half lost in their thoughts. When she turned toward booth number 7, their booth, something caught her eye. The table was empty now. No coffee cups, no plates. Just a small folded napkin sitting perfectly in the center. She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron, and walked over. The napkin wasn't from that morning. It was older, yellowed slightly at the edges. She hesitated before picking it up, her thumb brushing over the faint blue handwriting. It wasn't a receipt. It wasn't a note for the bill. It was a message for the waitress who listens. If anyone ever asks, tell them we made it home. Darlene blinked, reading it twice. Her chest tightened. She looked out the window, half expecting to see them still in the parking lot. The old woman with her careful hands, the man with the tired eyes. But the truck was gone. The road was empty. The rain had stopped hours ago, but a single drop slid down the glass, tracing a path like a tear that refused to fade. She turned the napkin over. There was a small black and white photograph taped to the back. Darlene gasped softly. It was a picture of 3 people, a young soldier in uniform, a woman in a floral dress, and a little girl sitting between them holding their hands. The girl's curls were wild and bright, her smile wide and free. The photograph had been taken in front of a diner. This diner. The sign behind them still read, Sonny's Diner, though the paint was fresh in the photo. Darlene's throat caught. "Lord," she whispered. The soldier was Henry Lawson. The woman was Margaret. And the child, the little girl with the wild curls, must have been their daughter, Grace. She stood there, frozen, as if she'd been handed a piece of time that didn't belong to her. Outside, the morning light grew stronger. It hit the photograph just right, making it glow faintly, as though the past was still alive beneath the paper. Darlene exhaled shakily, then walked to the counter. She opened the small frame that usually held the diner's weekly specials and slipped the photo inside. Now it sat there, right by the window, where the morning sun could find it every day. The bell above the door jingled, pulling her back. A little girl had come in, holding her father's hand. Her curls bounced as she looked around. "Daddy, can we sit by the window?" she asked. He smiled. "Sure thing, sweetheart." They sat at booth number 7. Darlene smiled softly, pouring them coffee and orange juice. "You picked the best seat in the house," she said. The little girl grinned. "Why?" Darlene pointed to the framed photograph on the sill. "Because it's got the best story." The girl leaned closer, studying it. "Who are they?" Darlene smiled faintly. "People who loved each other," she said, "and found their way home." The father looked at the picture too, his brow furrowing slightly. "Looks like it's been here a while," Darlene nodded. "Long enough to matter." Later that day, when the rush had passed, Darlene found herself back at the window again. The light had changed, softer now, warm and honey-colored. She looked at the photo, then out toward the open road that disappeared into the distance. For a second, she thought she saw something. 2 figures walking side by side, a woman in a cardigan and a man in an old jacket, moving slowly toward the sunlight. She blinked, and they were gone. But she smiled anyway. Some stories don't end. They just keep walking. Outside, the road shimmered beneath the setting sun. The clouds were drifting apart, and the world looked washed clean, like it had remembered how to begin again. A truck rolled past in the distance, its engine low and steady. For just a moment, the reflection of its headlights glimmered across the diner windows. two bright flashes, like a final wave goodbye. Inside, Darlene turned the open sign to closed and stood for a moment, her hand resting on the glass. Behind her, the framed photograph caught the last of the evening light. The faces in it, Henry, Margaret, and Grace, seemed to glow softly, forever caught in that perfect moment. Epilogue. 1 year later, the diner looked different now. The sign had been repainted, the booths reupholstered, and the walls adorned with framed photos, each one donated by people who'd come to share their stories. In the center of them, all hung the same picture, the one Darlene had found that morning. Below it, a small plaque read, "Letters Find Their Way Home," dedicated to Henry and Margaret Lawson, and every soul who kept waiting for love to return. Tourists often asked where the story came from. Darlene would just smile and pour another cup of coffee. "Depends who you ask," she'd say. "Some folks think it's just an old love story. Others say they still come by sometimes, sit at booth 7, order 2 coffees. Then she'd wink and walk away, leaving the story to live where it belonged, in the quiet space between truth and memory. The road home isn't a place. It's a person, and sometimes, if you're lucky, they're waiting right where you left them." It was nearly a month after the storm when Darlene found the letter. She wasn't even looking for it. The diner had emptied out for the night. The radio was playing softly, some old blues tune humming low against the buzz of the lights. Darlene was on her knees under the counter, searching for more receipt paper, when her hand brushed against something wedged deep behind the register. It wasn't a receipt roll. It was an envelope, yellowed, sealed, and brittle around the edges. Her heart gave a small, curious flutter. It looked old, too old. The paper had that smoky tint of something that had sat in silence for decades. Across the front, in faded handwriting, were the words, "For Grace, if she ever comes back." Darlene froze. The name hit her like a whisper she'd been waiting to hear. Grace, the little girl in the photograph. The daughter Henry and Margaret had loved and lost. She turned the envelope over. No return address. Just a smudge where a thumb must have pressed long ago. Her first thought was how. Her second thought was why now. Darlene hesitated for a moment, then carefully broke the seal. The paper inside was thin and soft, the ink smudged slightly from old tears. She unfolded it with trembling hands and began to read. "My dearest Grace, if you're reading this, then maybe you finally came home. I don't know where you are, baby. I don't even know if you made it out that night. The world was loud and cruel and too big for a child to carry alone, but I need you to know, your mama never stopped looking. Every Friday I sit at the same booth. I order 2 coffees, one for me and one for the little girl who still lives in my heart. I watch the road and listen for your laugh in every truck that passes. They told me you were gone, that the fire took everything. But a mother knows when her child's story isn't over. So if by some miracle you find this, come to the diner, sweetheart. Booth number 7. I'll be waiting. All my love, Mama." The words blurred as Darlene read them again and again, her breath trembling. This letter, it wasn't new. The edges were too soft, the ink too faded. It had been there, hidden behind that register, for years. And somehow, it had survived long enough to be found after the night Margaret and the stranger, her grown-up son, had reunited. She pressed a hand to her mouth. A cold realization washed over her. Grace wasn't the mother. Grace was the old woman's daughter, which meant the man who had walked into the diner that night, the stranger who had recognized the necklace, wasn't Margaret's son. He was Grace's, Margaret's, grandson. The diner lights flickered softly above her. Darlene sank into the nearest booth, the letter trembling in her hands. It all made sense now. Why the old woman had looked so fragile that night, like she was carrying the weight of years in silence. Why the man had looked both haunted and hopeful. Why the photograph had felt like a doorway instead of a memory. He hadn't just found a stranger who knew his father. He'd found the woman who had raised the mother he'd never met, a link in a broken chain, finally closed. Darlene folded the letter back up and held it for a long moment. She could still smell the faint scent of lavender on it, the same perfume Margaret used to wear. Her chest ached. But it wasn't sadness. It was something else. That strange, holy kind of ache that feels like truth settling into its final place. She stood, walked to the photo by the window, and slipped the letter behind the frame. Now, the picture had company. The story it had always needed to be complete. The next morning, as the sun climbed above the highway, Darlene unlocked the doors to the diner. The world outside was golden, the kind of light that makes even old paint look new. As she flipped the open sign, something caught her eye. A small piece of folded paper sat on the doorstep. No envelope, just a short note scrawled in quick, uneven handwriting. Darlene, thank you for keeping her memory safe. Grace made it home. Michael, Darlene's eyes widened. She looked toward the empty road, her heart racing. The note was fresh. The ink was still damp from the morning dew. Somewhere out there, they were still alive. Still driving, still healing. She went back inside, locked the door for a moment, and leaned against it, letting the weight of it all wash over her. She thought about all the people who'd sat at that same booth over the years, each carrying something: grief, regret, love, hope, and leaving behind traces of themselves in napkins and empty cups. Maybe that was what this place really was. Not a diner, but a sanctuary, a place where the lost found their way back, not always to the people they were looking for, but to the pieces of themselves they thought were gone. As she brewed a fresh pot of coffee, the bell above the door jingled again. A young woman walked in, early 30s, carrying a worn leather bag and a camera hanging from her neck. Her eyes were bright, curious, full of that quiet ache Darlene recognized instantly. "Morning," Darlene said warmly. "Coffee?" The woman smiled. "Please, and do you mind if I sit by the window?" "Booth 7?" Darlene asked with a knowing grin. The woman hesitated, then smiled wider. "Yeah, that one." As she sat, sunlight hit her hair, auburn with streaks of gold, and for just a second, Darlene swore she saw another face layered over hers. A younger version, freckles, wild curls, Grace. Darlene placed the cup gently on the table. The woman was staring at the photograph in the window, the one with the soldier, the nurse, and the little girl. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out and whispered, "I remember this." Darlene froze. The woman blinked back tears. "That was my mother," she said softly, "and my grandma." Then she turned the photo toward the light and smiled through her tears. "Guess I finally found my way home, too." Darlene couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes wet, her heart full. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "You know," she said softly, "I think they've been waiting for this for a long time." The woman smiled. "So have I." And outside, the sun broke free from the clouds, pouring gold through the glass, wrapping Booth 7 in the kind of light that felt almost like a blessing. The diner was quiet again. Outside, the sky had turned soft gray, rain tapping gently against the glass. Not the violent storm from before, but the kind that feels almost cleansing, like the world itself is remembering how to breathe. Grace sat in booth 7, her coffee untouched, both hands wrapped around the small silver locket Darlene had taken from behind the counter. It was heavier than she expected, not just in weight, but in memory. The clasp was slightly bent, the chain thin and fragile from years of wear. But when she turned it under the light, a small engraving caught her eye, one she hadn't noticed at first. 2 tiny letters carved into the back with the tip of something sharp. G.H. Her breath caught. Those were her initials. Not her mother's, not her grandmother's. Hers. Darlene watched her quietly from behind the counter, not wanting to interrupt whatever was unfolding. There was something sacred about it. The way Grace cradled that necklace, like she was holding time itself. Finally, Grace spoke, her voice a whisper. I thought it was gone forever. "My mom? She used to wear it when she tucked me in at night. She said it was lucky." that it kept our family close even when we were far apart. Her voice broke slightly. The night of the fire, she gave it to me. Told me to hold it tight. I didn't know it would be the last thing she ever gave me. Darlene's chest tightened. She'd heard pieces of the story from Margaret before, how her daughter and granddaughter vanished the night their small town burned, how the wreckage left nothing behind but rumors and ashes. But she'd never known the truth. Not like this. Grace rubbed her thumb over the metal, lost in the rhythm of it. She must have found it again somehow, she said softly. After I was taken away, after she thought I was gone. Darlene frowned. Taken? Grace nodded. There were men who came that night. Said they were helping us. But they weren't. They took me from the shelter, told me my mom didn't make it. She swallowed hard. I grew up thinking no one survived. Not her, not my grandmother. I bounced around for years. Never stayed anywhere long enough to belong. The rain thickened against the glass. Darlene felt her throat tighten as she whispered, And you just found your way back here? Grace gave a faint, tired laugh. Not exactly. I wasn't even supposed to stop here. My car broke down a few miles back. Then I saw the sign, Margaret's Diner. I thought it was coincidence. Her eyes flicked up, glistening. It wasn't. She set the locket on the table, tracing its outline with her finger. The rain's reflection shimmered in the metal, like light trying to find its way home. Darlene stepped closer. There's something you should see. She reached under the counter and pulled out an old metal tin, the kind that once held cookies, now filled with time-worn keepsakes. She'd found it the week after Margaret passed, tucked inside the storage closet. Inside were photographs, a small Bible, and a folded note. Darlene set the tin down gently in front of her. She left this for whoever found her story. Grace's hands shook as she opened the lid. The first thing she pulled out was a faded photo, her mother, young and bright-eyed, standing beside Margaret. They were both laughing, holding a baby wrapped in a floral blanket. Her. The second item was a folded slip of paper, yellowed, but still legible. For the one who carries my heart, if you ever find this, know that the necklace isn't a gift. It's a promise. Your mother made it from the chain of your father's dog tags, the ones he wore till the day he died. She said it was to remind you, no matter how lost the world makes you feel, you come from love. And love always finds its way back. Grandma Margaret Grace pressed the note to her chest. Tears finally slipped down her cheeks. Silent at first, then unstoppable. All those years of wondering, of feeling like she was born from loss instead of love, gone in a heartbeat. She hadn't been forgotten. She had been searched for. Every day, every Friday, every cup of coffee, every booth, 7. The rain eased, the diner bathed now in a soft, silvery glow. Grace looked up, wiping her tears. She waited for me here, didn't she? Darlene nodded, eyes misty. Every week. Same time, same seat. She said one day you'd walk through that door. Grace laughed softly through her tears. Guess I'm just a little late. Right on time, Darlene whispered. A few minutes later, as the rain stopped, Grace stepped outside. The parking lot glistened, puddles reflecting the diner's neon sign like pieces of memory scattered across the ground. She opened her hand. The locket lay there, shining faintly under the soft morning light. She unclasped it carefully, and for the first time opened it. Inside were 2 tiny photographs, worn and faded, but still clear enough to see. On the left, her mother, smiling, holding her as a baby. On the right, a man she didn't recognize, tall, in a military uniform, his eyes kind. Her father, her breath hitched. Her grandmother's letter echoed in her mind. The necklace was made from his chain. It's a promise. She closed it gently, holding it against her heart. When she walked back inside, Darlene was by the counter pouring 2 cups of coffee. Thought maybe you'd want one for her, she said softly. Grace smiled, tears still glimmering in her eyes. Yeah, she whispered. She always liked hers black, right? Darlene nodded. Strong and simple. Said it kept her heart steady. They carried the cups to booth 7 together, setting one across the table where the old woman once sat. Grace reached out, touched the empty cup, and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up." A small tear slipped down her cheek, landing in the coffee like a baptism. Quiet, reverent, real. For a long time, neither woman spoke. The diner hummed softly around them, the faint buzz of the lights, the clink of rain dripping from the roof, the whisper of wind against the glass. Finally, Grace stood. Slipping the locket back around her neck, she smiled at Darlene. "You said this place keeps memories safe?" Darlene nodded. "Always has." Grace looked around, at the photo on the wall, the coffee cups, the light spilling in from the window, and smiled softly. "Then I think I'll stay for a while," she said. "There's still a lot of stories in here waiting to be found." And for the first time in decades, Booth 7 wasn't a place of waiting anymore. It was home. Morning had fully arrived now. The storm had passed, leaving the sky streaked with soft gold. The diner, once just a stop on a forgotten highway, felt alive again. Grace stayed behind after Darlene locked up. She wasn't ready to leave just yet. She sat in booth 7, the same spot her grandmother had claimed for years, tracing circles on the tabletop with her fingertip. The coffee had gone cold again, but she didn't mind. Some warmth doesn't come from cups. It comes from closure. Across from her sat that second cup, the one Darlene had poured for Margaret. Steam no longer rose from it, but something about it still felt alive. Like love itself had a seat there. When Grace finally stood to go, she left a small folded napkin beside that cup. No note, no name, just a faint outline where a tear had fallen, blurring the ink. The locket hung around her neck again, shining brighter now that she knew its story. It wasn't just jewelry anymore. It was a promise fulfilled, a circle closed, a legacy unbroken. As she pushed open the diner door, a cool breeze swept through, rattling the chime above, the same way it had the night everything began. Darlene looked up from behind the counter, smiling softly. "See you next Friday?" she asked. Grace smiled back. Every Friday. Then she stepped out into the sunlight. No longer the lost girl who'd stumbled into a storm, but the woman who had walked through it and found her name again. Hours later, Darlene moved through the diner, cleaning tables and refilling sugar jars. When she reached booth 7, she saw the napkin Grace had left behind. She unfolded it carefully. Inside, written in soft, shaky handwriting, were just 4 words. "You kept your promise." Darlene froze, her heart catching in her chest. Because those weren't Grace's words, she recognized that handwriting. Old-fashioned, looping, deliberate. Margaret's. The napkin looked new, but the ink was faded, like it had been written years ago and left waiting. Darlene's eyes filled with tears. She turned it over and saw a small smudge in the corner, the same kind of coffee stain that always appeared when Margaret left notes for her staff. And suddenly, she understood. The note hadn't appeared today. It had been there, tucked between the cracks of the booth's wood, hidden beneath the napkin dispenser, all this time. Just waiting for Grace to find it, waiting for her to come home. The camera, if visualized, would linger here, Darlene sitting in the quiet diner, sunlight streaming across the checkered floor, the napkin trembling in her hands. She looked toward the empty booth and whispered, "You did it, Miss Margaret. She's home." Outside, a wind swept through the parking lot, carrying the faint sound of wind chimes. For a heartbeat, Darlene could swear she saw a figure standing in the reflection of the glass. The outline of an older woman smiling gently from booth 7. But when she blinked, it was gone. Only the glow of the morning light remained. Later that evening, as the neon sign flickered on, Margaret's, diner humming against the dusk, a new photo appeared on the wall beside the counter. It was a candid picture. Darlene must have taken it that morning. Grace, sitting in booth 7, smiling softly, holding the locket against her chest. Beneath it, In small cursive letters, Darlene had written, "The ones who wait, find." And just like that, the diner's story, Margaret's story, wasn't about waiting anymore. It was about finding what was lost, finding who we are, finding home even after years of storms. As the lights dimmed and the last car passed on the empty road, the camera, or the viewer's imagination, would drift back to that corner booth, the napkin still folded on the table, the necklace glinting faintly in the photo on the wall, and a soft whisper that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. You kept your promise. Then the bell over the diner door jingles one last time, and the screen fades to black. If this story reminded you that some promises are stronger than time, tap that subscribe button and ring the bell, because here, we tell stories that remind the world love never forgets. Have you ever found something that carried more than memory, something that brought a piece of the past back to you? Tell us in the comments below. Your story might just inspire our next one, and here's a little challenge for our sharp-eyed viewers. There's a quiet moment around minute 7:42 when Darlene finds the napkin, where something flickers in the reflection of the diner's glass. Did you catch it? Watch again and tell us what you think you saw, because in Margaret's diner, every reflection tells a story, and some promises never fade.